Germany has announced a complete ban on activities of the Palestinian group Hamas and ordered the disbanding of a pro-Palestine group accused of spreading anti-Israel and anti-Semitic ideas. In a statement, German Interior Minister Nancy Faeser said she implemented a formal ban on activity by or in support of Hamas, which is already designated a terrorist organization in the country. Joining me now to speak on the updates on the war today is Professor Darren Q. He's Executive Director, UMass Boston Center for Peace, Democracy and Development, and he joins us from Belfast in Northern Ireland. Thank you for joining us on World Now. It's been 33 days since the war began. Do you see an end in sight, or is this likely to linger like the Russia-Ukraine situation?
Thank you for having me today. I do think this is likely to drag on for some time yet. We have the period now where the Israelis have the initiative, and they're not going to stop until they feel that they have Hamas in some sort of a security bind, and where they feel that they have a sufficient security barrier between Gaza and Israel. And that's going to take some time, several weeks at least, I would expect. But then after that, Prime Minister Netanyahu has said very clearly that there's going to be some sort of security responsibility that Israel is going to take, perhaps some sort of version of what we see on the West Bank, where Israel has ready access to Gaza and will have some sort of military commitment in the area.
But how easy do you think it would be for Israel to, when this confrontation is over, to actually be the one to secure Gaza? Because already Antony Blinken has mentioned that it would be important for the Palestinian people to decide the way forward.
Yes, I think this is deja vu all over again. Israel has already in the past tried to control Gaza and was fairly unsuccessful in doing so. This is definitely a situation, I think, the longer that Israel is there, the more it's going to be sapping its military strength. So I think Israel is going to be keen to find some sort of a political solution in the medium term that does hand over some sort of at least local administrative power back to Palestinians, but retains some security guarantees for Israel and security oversight. Getting to that middle ground, though, is going to take some time. And I think it's going to be a big question now as to how far is Israel going to go? How much further is it going to inflict the sort of casualties that we're seeing there in order to attain the security objectives, and particularly in terms of trying to beat back Hamas or ultimately somehow hobble Hamas so that it's no longer a threat?
No, that's a real question that perhaps only Benjamin Netanyahu would be able to answer. But we know that the Group of Seven is working, trying to close a deal and ensure that there's some level of humanitarian ceasefire, there in the Gaza Strip. But how do you see Israel respond to that? Because they have insisted that for any deals to be reached, then Hamas must release all hostages it is holding.
I think Israel is definitely going to continue to push that. And I think what this brings up really from a peace perspective is the larger power dynamics in the region. In other words, what sort of leverage are the Americans going to bring on Israel to try to rein in or to say when enough is enough? And how much pressure is Iran going to bring on Hamas and to some extent Hezbollah in the north in Lebanon to come to some sort of a deal and to release more of those hostages? And I think to some extent, some of the initiative here is in Tehran and Washington at the moment in terms of how much pressure is going to be brought on Israel and Hamas to sort of come to some sort of a conclusion. I think that that's going to take some time. On the American side, the Americans have nothing but to lose at this point from the situation in Gaza, whereas on the Iranian side, I think the Iranians are probably looking at this as possible leverage to push the Americans to ratchet back sanctions on Iran. The Americans are not going to want to do that in the current climate. So that's an extremely difficult situation. And I think where other international mediators may have to get engaged to try to push the Iranians and the Americans to try to come to some sort of understanding or deal in this regard.
Indeed, there's that fear of escalation because already it appears to be spreading. We're hearing of shots from Lebanon, just as you've mentioned, Hezbollah trying to, take on Israel also. But in the midst of all of this, women and children are bearing the brunt. And the UN is so saddened about this. And I mean, what do you think is workable? What is possible? Because the infrastructure keeps going down on a daily basis.
I think this is only going to get worse, I'm afraid, precisely because, Hamas is so embedded in civilian areas all across Gaza, very consciously so. This is part of Hamas's strategy in order to draw Israel into attack areas that will lead to high levels of civilian casualties. We're already at numbers where for every one Israeli that was killed in Hamas's attack, probably 10 Palestinians are already dead, and that number is only going to increase as we see the days moving forward and as the Israeli offensive continues. So I think that we're going to be in a position where the UN and other humanitarian actors are going to be scrambling to try to save as many lives as possible. A big question is going to be how many people are going to be forced out of Gaza City further south into other parts of Gaza where I think Israel would prefer more Palestinians to be, but that's going to be a massive transfer of people. That's going to lead to increasing suffering, and it's going to need a lot of humanitarian assistance. I think that's where you're going to see actors like the Americans and the Europeans stepping up to try to provide more funding for Palestinians in terms of humanitarian assistance. But ultimately, we're going to see, I think, a lot more loss of life, I fear, before we see initially some sort of a ceasefire deal and then some sort of negotiation over a longer-term renegotiation of the political settlement.
We know that already an evacuation route from north to southern Gaza has been in operation for about 5 days now. And, just as you mentioned earlier, if indeed Hamas is deliberately trying to use soft targets as human shield in this war, and there is a call about Israel engaging in some form of genocide, then really where is do I call it the morality now of the Palestine Authority?
The morality of the Palestinian Authority in this regard? Well, I think, we have to distinguish between the Palestinian Authority and Hamas, even though Hamas obviously, is a governing actor in Gaza. And as you said, there's no doubt that international actors have cited war crimes on both sides in this conflict, and that's only going to increase moving forward. I do think that kind of pressure is going to be important. It's going to take a multi-pronged strategy on the international community's side. The human rights actors are going to have to be and continue to be as tough as they have been on both the Israeli and Palestinian actors to say, look, there are war crimes here. People are going to be held account for that, while the humanitarian actors are moving in there to try to deal with the suffering issues. And whereas the peace actors are then going to have to work with the governing bodies and try to broker some sort of a back channel deal between these actors, first to get a ceasefire as soon as possible, and then second to try to get a longer term agreement over the political status. In terms of the Palestinian Authority, I think this certainly does shine the light on the difficult position that President Abbas and the Palestinian Authority faces, and in terms of the weakness of influence he has over Gaza. What role can the Palestinian Authority take in Gaza moving forward? These are really important questions that are going to have to be dealt with by Palestinian political leaders as soon as possible. There are opportunities here for democratic forces. I'm thinking of civil society actors in particular in Israel and in Palestine on both sides to try to up the pressure. I would really like to see more people in the streets protesting peacefully over the current situation and pushing both the Palestinian Authority and the Netanyahu government to move a really comprehensive two-state solution forward, which a number of international actors have been saying out there has to be one of the key outcomes of all of this.
And finally, in about 30 seconds, and some school of thought have been conversing for a two-state solution. Do you think that's the way to go?
I do think that is the way to go at this point. A two-state solution or a one-state solution, which are both items of conversation out there. Neither one of them is going to make either side particularly happy, but the two-state solution of the options that are available out there, I think provides the most at least reasonable opportunity for both populations to live in peace. It's going to take time to get there. The Israelis are going to have to make some very important concessions on the West Bank, particularly in terms of the expanding of settlements that have been going on for years. Those are going to have to be rolled back, which is political poison for Israeli governments to think about, but it's something that's going to have to be there. And on the Palestinian side, the Palestinian Authority is going to have to try to democratize further, have a government that truly represents more interests on the ground, and is going to have to deal with internal corruption issues as well.
Professor Darren Q, it's been a pleasure speaking with you. Thank you for talking to us on The World Now.
Thank you for having me.